And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
And welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to get into some opinion scholarship about the Great Flood, the deluge, as you might have heard it called. We're going to talk about old Noah. We're going to talk about biblical stories, but this is what I want to do today. It's obviously interesting to me when you see a myth appear in various cultures across time, especially if they're seemingly unrelated, distant. It's really interesting to wonder why those stories would appear over and over again. I think there's something important and maybe something lost that needs to be unraveled or uncovered to figure out why this common thread seems to be some primordial story that everybody knows. And the story of the Great Flood is, prime among these types of stories. I don't know about you, but I was familiar with the idea that these flood myths appear all over the place for a long time. And I thought that was interesting for a long time. I spent a little bit of time, obviously, understanding the biblical story because I grew up as a Christian, so that's something that is to be expected. But also I spent some time looking at the Sumerian or really Babylonian account, which turns out the biblical story borrows very heavily from, and they probably have some common origin, or maybe even the biblical story comes from the older Babylonian account. Seems like that's a likely story. But with all of the other stories, all of these other flood stories, it's really always been somebody saying, oh yeah, the Chinese have one. Oh yeah, they have one in India. Oh yeah, there's Native American tribes that have the same sort of story. I bumped into one. I read a book called The Book of the Hopi years ago by Frank Waters. It's a tremendous book about the Hopi Indians from New Mexico. And they have a flood story, and he recounts it in that book. And it's interesting, and it has lots of parallels to the biblical story. So I really wanted to know what the original sources said about the flood. It's no longer acceptable for me to talk high level from somebody else's voice, something I read on the Wikipedia, right? It's not satisfactory anymore. One of the things I like to do on this podcast is look at primary sources, try to make my own opinion. And so I guess what that does is it makes today's story time is going to be, the Great Flood Story Hour, where I really want to actually read to you these primary sources in case you, like me, are interested to know what these stories actually say, and you want to make a judgment for yourself about how similar they are to the biblical story and just what the hell that might mean. All right, so it's possible that a Great Flood story that appears everywhere because it's memorializing a real event. So some of you have probably heard about the Younger Dryas impact theory. There's all kinds of other sort of catastrophic flooding scenarios that have been pitched by historians and geologists and people in the past to give some explanation for why the flood myth appears everywhere. A localized flooding doesn't seem a likely candidate when the story appears in the New World as well as the Old World. So if it is memorializing a real event, it had to have been a global catastrophic thing. It had to have been. Another possibility is that the flood story is just another expression of an archetype that we see in mythology all the time. It's the archetype of death and resurrection, death and rebirth. We have that story, everywhere you look. This story of redemption and rebirth is all over our religious stories and mythological stories. Is the flood just another version of that? It's like, men become wicked, they have to be destroyed, and then a new God brings about a new beginning and a new world. How similar is that to Jesus dying for the sins of the world and then resurrecting? You see what I mean? The dying and resurrection theme, or myth theme, as they call it, it has that pattern that we see lots of other places. We see it with the myth of Dionysus. We talked about the Orphics and the sort of following the story of Demeter, and also Dionysus dying and being reborn, and the story of the seasons, the kind of rebirth of the spring, or the whatever it is. All these myths are everywhere. Is it possible that a great flood myth and then a survival story, an unlikely survival story, is just another account of a death and rebirth scenario? Or is it based on some real event? I don't know what you think. I don't know what I think exactly. So I guess what I want to do here is I want to just jump in. I selected a handful of these stories is because it's going to take a while probably. And in the sake of time, I didn't include any from the New World. I didn't include any from the Far East. So I'm really looking here at a handful of stories: Greek stories, Roman stories, stories from ancient Mesopotamia, the Babylonian, Sumerian stories, and one from India. So we're going to talk about those and those only. And these stories kind of go from maybe 1800 BC. That's the earliest written account of the Babylonian, Sumerian creation stories, flood stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that kind of thing. Those stories probably go back double that, maybe more. Who knows with these oral traditions? Who knows? But we know the stories go back at least to about 1800 BC. And the stories that we'll talk about today are going to go from 1800 BC. They're going to span all the way up to about the first and second century AD. And I want to bring forth one of the more recent stories. I want to do it first for lots of reasons. The one I'm going to talk about today is from a poem. So forgive me because I'm going to read poetry to you today by a famous Roman poet named Ovid. And if you know Ovid, if you know anything of Ovid, you know this poem. It's called Metamorphosis. And again, this is coming from Rome, first century. This poem was written right around 8 of the Common Era, 8 AD. I'm going to say AD because I really dislike the Common Era, before Common Era distinction. I'm an old school man. AD, BC, let's stick with that. So 8 CE or 8 AD. Ovid writes this poem, Metamorphosis, this epic poem. I can't read it all to you. We'd be here forever. But I want to read a section. And in the story, in the poem, the section I'm going to read to you now is immediately following this myth, this retelling of a Greek myth that we see all the way back in 500 BC from Hesiod, which is of the ages of man. And the Greeks believed that the gods created man many times. And for various reasons, each attempt of creating man fails. The first men are made of gold and they're perfect beings. The second wave of men are made of silver, then of bronze, then of iron, that kind of thing. And so that story is unfolding. Ovid is telling that story, and we get right to the current race of human beings, the men of iron, and it goes like this. Hard steel succeeded then, and stubborn as the metal were the men. Truth, modesty, and shame the world forsook. Fraud, avarice, and force their places took. Now brandished weapons glittering in their hands, mankind is broken loose from moral bands. Nor were the gods themselves more safe above. Against beleaguered heaven the giants move. Hills piled on hills, on mountains mountains lie, to make their mad approaches to the sky, till Jove, no longer patient, took his time to avenge with thunder their audacious crime. So let me just stop there for just a second. So you see the beauty, even in the English translation, of the poetry. It's more difficult to read this way, but it adds something to it. So this is what we're going to do while we're reading Ovid. The reason I stop here is because there's some interesting things that I want to make sure you pick up on. I'm telling you the story to tell you about the flood, but I have to kind of ease into it because the story is a longer narrative. So what this piece is saying here is that these human beings are made of iron, right? And they used to be truthful and modest, and now they're full of fraud and avarice, right? So he's talking about this last race of humans being even the worst. It's like this is the worst round of humans that we've created, and it talks about them being breaking their bonds of morality, that these are bad men. But then it says something strange that I want to make sure you notice. He says, after he's talking about how bad the men are, he says, nor were the gods themselves more safe above. Against beleaguered heaven, the giants move. So it's not just humans that are bad that is the problem, that is, threatening to the gods. It's these giants. These giants are coming after the gods. So you have these immoral, corrupted human beings, but you also have these terrible giants that seem to be threatening heaven. I don't know what that makes you think of. And I honestly don't know what the reference to is here, but I imagine because the Titanomachy is something they're talking about in the same poem. This is the war of the Olympian gods against the Titans. The Titans are these primordial gods and primordial forces that existed before the Olympians. They're the original, round of gods that are created, and they're described as giants. So perhaps we're talking about the Titans. Prometheus, as an example, was a Titan. So maybe this is what we're talking about, but it also reminds me of something biblical, right? In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, when they're talking about creation, just as Ovid is doing now, they talk about the sons of God coming into the daughters of men and taking wives from the human beings and having children with them, and those children are giants upon the earth. And if you've heard that word in the Hebrew, it's Nephilim, so that may ring a bell. These giants are called Nephilim. So right before you get to the flood account in the Bible, there's these stories of giants. Right before you get to the flood account in Ovid, there's these stories of giants. And it gets even more interesting. It says, hills piled on hills, on mountains, mountains lie, to make their mad approaches to the sky. What does that sound like? These giants are piling mountains on top of each other to make a ladder, to make a bridge up to heaven where they can take on the gods, where they can take on the Olympians. They're building a structure to reach heaven, right? That is the story of the Tower of Babel, also taking place in the early chapters of Genesis. So I just want to show you in the first century, this Roman story with these strange parallels to lots of biblical stories, even before we get to the flood account. All right, back to the poetry. Ovid says, singed with the flames and with the bolts transfixed, with native earth their blood the monsters mixed. The blood imbued with animating heat did impregnate earth, new sons beget. They, like the seeds from which they sprung, accursed, against the gods immortal hatred nursed, an impious, arrogant, and cruel brood, expressing their original from blood. All right, let me just stop there for a second. So we're continuing to talk about the giants here, singed with flames and with the bolts transfixed. Listen to this. With native earth, their blood, the monsters mixed. The blood imbued with animating heat did impregnate earth, new sons beget. What is he saying here? He seems to be saying that these giants mixed with human beings and made great creatures, sons, new sons to be born into the world that are some sort of a hybrid. And this, again, is exactly what you hear from the biblical account we spoke about earlier with the Nephilim. The Nephilim said they took wives from which they chose, and that their children were giants, mighty men of old, it says, men of renown. So the blood of the gods was mixed with that of the earth, and this is what we have here. With native earth, their blood, the monsters mixed. And there's one other little thing here that's worth mentioning, which is in the ancient versions of the creation story, in the most ancient versions, they're talking about the Sumerian, Babylonian versions, when human beings are created, a god is killed, a god named Kingu, and the clay that's used to form man, that blood is mixed in with it. Right? So in order to make man, the blood of the god has to be mixed in. The life force of the god has to be mixed into the clay form that makes the first human being. That's what it is that brings it to life. It's the lifeblood of the god itself, the divine life put into that clay. And so with native earth, their blood, the monsters mixed, also sounds quite a lot like this ancient Babylonian story of the creation of human beings. Isn't that interesting? All right, Ovid. What else does Ovid have to say? He says, which when the king of gods beheld from high, he sighed, nor longer with his pity strove, but kindled to a wrath becoming Jove. Then called a general council of the gods, who summoned issue from their blessed abodes. All right, Jove is just the Roman name for Zeus, if that's confusing to you. But Zeus is now calling an assembly, a council of all the gods, right? They have something to talk about. What is that something? The threat from how immoral human beings have become, the threat of these terrible giants, and whatever they're doing with human beings. He goes on, he says, when all were placed in seats distinctly known, and he, their father, had assumed the throne, upon his ivory scepter first he leant, then shook his head that shook the firmament. Man, it makes the hair stand up on my arms. Zeus shakes his head, right, in dismay. And that shakes the earth. That's like an earthquake. I just love it. I love it. He says, now whatsoever ambient waters glide, all are corrupt, all must be destroyed. Yet still with pity they remember man, and mourn as much as heavenly spirits can. They ask when those were lost of humane birth, what he would do with all this waste of earth. To whom the father of the gods replied, lay that unnecessary fear aside. Mine be the care, new people to provide. I will from wondrous principles ordain a race unlike the first, and try my skill again. So this council of gods is hearing Zeus say, look, we got to do something about this. We got to destroy these giants. We got to destroy these humans. We have to start over because they're beyond repair. And the gods are expressing some concern about that. They said they mourn as much as heavenly spirits can. They ask when those were lost of humane birth, what he would do with all this waste of earth. He's saying, with all these human beings destroyed, what are you going to do with the earth? What now? And Zeus says, fear not, I will bring man back. We will try this again. Okay. Remember, we were talking about the 5 different ages of human beings being destroyed and remade differently. This is just, hey, let's do it again. All right, so he says, concludes to pour a watery deluge down, and what he durst not burn resolves to drown. The skies from pole to pole with peals resound, and showers enlarged come pouring on the ground. Now seas and earth were in confusion lost, a world of waters and without a coast. The most of mortals perished in the flood. The small remainder dies for want of food. A mountain of stupendous height there stands, betwixt the Athenian and Boeotian lands. Parnassus is its name, whose forky rise mounts through the clouds and mates the lofty skies. High on the summit of this dubious cliff, Deucalion wafting, moored his little skiff. He with his wife were only left behind. Of perished many, they too were humankind. So what has he said here? Well, all kinds of shit that will sound familiar to you if you went to Sunday school, right? He's saying the rains came pouring down, they flooded everything, all of the people died, and the ones that survived the flood died because they couldn't find anything to eat. Everybody died. However, in this high mountain nearby, Mount Parnassus in this case, there's somebody named Deucalion who's on a boat, right? Moored his little skiff. He comes to rest on a mountain peak from this flood. He was in a boat. He finds himself saved, right, at the top of this mountain peak. And it says very clearly, he with his wife were only left behind. There are no other human beings, just Deucalion and his wife. He goes on, it says, the most upright of mortal men was he, the most sincere and holy woman she. When Jupiter, surveying earth from high, beheld it in a lake of water lie, that where so many millions lately lived, but 2, the best of either sex, survived. He loosed the northern winds, fierce Boreas flies, to puff away the clouds and purge the skies. The sovereign bids him peaceful sounds inspire, and gives the waves the signal to retire. Right, so these only Deucalion and his wife survive. Zeus, in this case, they're calling him Jupiter now, looks down, he sees what's going on. He starts to pull the flood back. And it says, a thin circumference of land appears, but not at once her visage rears. By slow degrees into their channels crawl, and earth increases as the waters fall. In longer time the tops of trees appear, which mud on their dishonored branches bear. At length the world was all restored to view, but desolate and of a sickly hue. The careful couple joins their tears, and invoked the gods with pious prayers. Before the gradual prostrate they adored, the pavement kissed, and the saint implored. All right, so what's happening here? So the waters come back, they start to recede. Everything looks destroyed and desperate. And what do? Deucalion and his wife, they immediately pray to the gods with pious prayers, prostrate themselves on the ground, and implore to the gods for help. And it goes on like this. O righteous Themis, if the powers above by prayers are bent to pity and to love, if humane miseries can move their mind, if yet they can forgive and yet be kind, tell how we may restore by second birth mankind and people desolated earth. Then thus the gracious goddess said, depart, and with your vestments veil your head, and stooping lowly down with loosened zones, throw each behind your backs your mighty mother's bones. This earth our mighty mother is. The stones in her capacious body are her bones. Descending from the mount, they first unbind. Their vests and veiled, they cast the stones behind. Then swelled and swelling by degrees grew warm, and took the rudiments of human form. By help of powers divine in little space, with the man through assumed a manly face, and what the wife renewed, the female race. So what is going on here? So I want to point to you here that if you know from the biblical story, when Noah first lands on the mountain and the waters begin to recede, when he comes out, the first thing he does is build an altar and pray to God. And this is exactly what you see with Deucalion. And the prayers that they make are heard. The goddess Themis hears the prayers and comes down and says, I'll grant your wishes, basically. And what are their wishes? And Deucalion says, tell me how we may restore by second birth mankind and people desolated earth. He wants to know, how can we repopulate the earth? How can we bring mankind back? And she tells them to throw their mother's bones. And it's very strange. What does that mean? And Deucalion says, this earth our mighty mother is. The stones in her capacious body are her bones. So the goddess is telling them to pick up the bones of their primordial mother, Mother Earth. These are just stones. And to throw them behind them into the water, which they do. And the stones that Deucalion throws become more men to repopulate the earth. And the stones that his wife throw become the women that are going to be there to help repopulate the earth. This is the blessing that the gods bestow on Deucalion for being righteous, for surviving the flood, for not cursing the gods after this desolation, but by worshiping them and making offerings. And for all of that, the goddess blesses them and gives them their heart's desire, which is to repopulate the earth. And this is exactly what you see in the biblical story when God tells them to be fruitful and multiply. So this gives you some idea. I hope you see some of the familiar components to the Noah, the biblical story. This is the Roman version. So I want to give you some more. I want to go to ancient India. This is actually the second oldest of the stories that we're going to talk about. The one we just read, the Roman version, obviously is much more recent, first century, beginning of the first century. This story goes back to maybe 700 BC. The oral version may be even longer. What I'm going to read from today is basically a commentary on the Vedas from ancient India called the Shatapatha Brahmana. And this, again, maybe 700 to 500 BC is approximately when this was written. Again, it may actually go back further in time than that, but it gives you some idea how ancient this is. It's not 1800 or 1700 BC like we're going to see when we get to the Babylonian story, but this is the second oldest account. So try to compare this in your mind to what Ovid just told us and what we know from the Noah story from the Bible. The translation I'm going to read to you is Julius Egling's translation from the late 1800s, but it goes like this. In the morning, they brought to Manu water for washing. Okay, so you don't know who Manu is, but just imagine Manu is this Noah character. There's lots of names we're going to throw around. Deucalion is the Greek-Roman version. Manu is the Indian version. Manu just means man, and it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Manu sounds a lot like man. So let me just start over. In the morning, they brought to Manu water for washing. When he was washing, a fish came into his hands. It spake to him. It said, "Rear me, I will save thee. A flood will carry away all these creatures. From that, I will save thee." Okay, so this is very different, right? I don't know who Manu is, but we're going back to ancient times. Somebody's brought him water to wash with. When he goes down and starts washing his hands, a fish has found its way into this tub and swims up into his hands and begins to speak to him. Now, in Hinduism, when something like this happens, very often it's not an ordinary animal, as you can imagine. In Hinduism, this is very likely an avatar, an incarnation of a god, whether that be Brahma or Vishnu. And the different versions of this story assume the fish to be Vishnu, others Brahma. So, take that as it is. This incarnation of God in the shape of a fish is asking Manu for help. And he says, a flood is going to come. If you help me, I'll help you. And Manu says, how am I to rear thee? Right? This fish is saying, take care of me, raise me. And he's like, how am I supposed to do that? The story goes on. The fish says, as long as we are small, there is great destruction for us. Fish devours fish. Thou will first keep me in a jar. When I outgrow that, thou will dig a pit and keep me in it. When I outgrow that, that will take me down to the sea, for then I shall be beyond destruction. Right? So you see what the fish is saying. It's like, look, if you leave me to my own devices, I'm going to get eaten. But keep me safe until I get big. And then you can put me back in the ocean and I will be fine. Can you do this for me? And the story goes on. It says, it soon became a large fish. Thereupon it said, in such a year that flood will come. Thou shalt then attend to my advice by preparing a ship. And when the flood has risen, thou shalt enter into the ship, and I will save thee from it. Right, so now we've had the flood idea introduced. We have this foreknowledge warning of the flood introduced, all very familiar. We have the directions to build a boat, right, all very familiar. So now we're starting to get into it. It goes on, it says, after he had reared it, he took it down to the sea, and he attended to the advice of the fish by preparing a ship. And when the flood had risen, he entered into the ship. The fish then swam up to him, and its horn he tied to the rope of the ship, and by that means he passed swiftly up to yonder northern mountain. Right, so how he gets to the mountain is by the help of the fish, of the avatar of God, who's taking him to safety. So this is an interesting twist. In this case, it doesn't name the mountain, right? In the Ovid story, it was Mount Parnassus. We know it's Mount Ararat in the Bible, of course. In this story, it's to yonder northern mountain. Now, if you're in India, there are several mountain ranges. Depending on where you are in India, there might be one or more mountain to the north. But if you're wondering what the northern mountain is, when you look at the map of India, you know that its north is covered by the greatest mountain range on earth, the Himalayas. So it seems to me that the tallest mountain where the floods can't quite get to, that yonder northern mountain may very well be some peak in the Himalayas. All right, the story continues. It then said, I have saved thee. Fasten the ship to a tree. As the waters subside, thou mayest gradually descend. The flood then swept away all these creatures, and Manu alone remained here. Right? So the flood comes, it kills all of the creatures, it kills all of the men. Right? Manu was not told to bring his wife. He was not told to bring animals 2 by 2. So it is literally just Manu. There is nothing else. And the story continues. Being desirous of offspring, he engaged in worshiping. He had offered up in the waters clarified butter, sour milk, whey, and curds. Thence a woman was produced. Becoming quite solid, she rose and came to Manu. All right, so again, picture this. This terrible flood has gone by. You have discovered you are the only living creature who to have survived it. No other even of your species is around. So he's desperate. And what do you do when you're desperate and you have nothing? You put your hands together and you pray to God. Right? This is exactly what Noah does when the flood recedes. He comes out, he makes an offering to God. It's exactly what Ovid told us that Deucalion did when the waters receded. And Manu does the same thing. Now, for different reasons, but he does the same thing. He makes this offering of libations, pours it into the water, and then some magic happens where his offering, right, his prayer is answered. And his offering becomes a woman, right? So now he can repopulate the earth. That is the answer to his prayer. Just like we saw with Thames in the Ovid story, who goes and grants Deucalion the ability to repopulate the earth by throwing those stones into the water. The same thing's happening here. That God is answering Manu's prayer, giving him the woman so that he can repopulate the earth. Right now, she comes to Manu, and the story continues. Manu said to her, "Who art thou?" And she says, "Thy daughter. Those offerings which thou madest in the waters, with them thou hast begotten me. I am the blessing. Whatever blessing thou shalt invoke through me shall be granted to thee." With her he went on worshiping, wishing for offspring. Through her he generated the race of Manu. Right? So through her and the blessing, the answer of his prayer, he's able to repopulate the earth. This is the same conclusion. A lot of the little components that you're used to seeing are missing from this story. There's no reason given for the flood. There's no account of family or animals being brought on. There's no talk about how long the flood lasts, and you're going to see this as a theme where we're told how long the flood lasts, and it's always the same number of days and nights, which is an interesting thing. We don't see that here. We also don't see this little detail that we see in the Bible, but we also see in the Babylonian story about the releasing of birds to see whether the water has receded. So lots of little details missing in this, the second oldest of the stories. Obviously, this story takes place in India, so a long way away from Rome or Greece, but it gives you some interesting contrast. Now I want to give you the Greek version. It's pretty short. It comes from a couple of sources. The older one is Apollodorus, and there's a book. It's just called the Library, a Bibliotheca. It's the Apollodorus' Library, and it's a compilation of these Greek mythological stories from the 1st, 2nd century AD, something like that. And the story of Deucalion's flood appears in Apollodorus. So I'm going to give you, it's really quick. We'll give you the details. Later, there was one, but maybe around 150 AD, by a fellow named Lucian. He wrote a book called The Syrian Goddess, and in that book, he recounts the tale of Deucalion. And what I want to mention about Lucian is that Lucian is not a Greek. So he's talking about this Greek story from around the same time as Apollodorus, who was a Greek, but he's talking about it from an outsider's perspective, which is interesting. He's also living closer to the Middle East, and there's more details in his version that sound like the biblical version, and you'll notice that. So I'm going to give you the older version first from Apollodorus, the more Greek version. And this part picks up in the story immediately after Prometheus creates man. So in the story, the ancient Greek story, Prometheus has a hand in the creation of human beings. That's why he loves them so much. That's why he steals fire from the gods against the will of Zeus to give them something to flourish with. And in that part of the story, it's talking about how Prometheus is making human beings from clay and water. I bring that up because we're talking about another familiar item. In the Bible, man is made from the dust of the ground, from clay. In the Babylonian version, it's very similar. So I'm going to save that, but I just want you to see some of the overlap. Human beings formed from water and clay. So the story picks up like this. Prometheus had a son, Deucalion. He was king of the area around Pythia and married Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus, and Pandora, whom the gods made as the first woman. So you're seeing some familiar names. You're seeing Prometheus. You're seeing Pandora. So those are names that surround these biblical stories about the creation of human beings. We all know about Pandora's box and so forth. But Pandora is the first created woman, so she's kind of like the Eve character. And there's a callback here to the original created man associated with this new character, Deucalion, the Noah guy, who's going to be essentially the next Adam, right? All the other humans die, and he's the one, the Noah guy, he's the one that carries on the human race. He becomes the new Adam. So he should be associated in some way with the old Adam or the old Eve. And that's what you see here while you're talking about Prometheus, the creator of man, and Pandora, the first created woman. Okay, so again, he's just saying Prometheus had a son, Deucalion. He was a king. He was married to Pyrrha. And then it says, when Zeus wished to wipe out the bronze race, right? So now we're getting to the point where the flood is getting ready to come. We talked about the ages of man earlier, and the human beings are being created over and over again. When we get to the point where Zeus is like, this last race I made, they've kind of met their last straw situation. We gotta get rid of them and start again. There's another ancient Greek author named Aeschylus who tells the same story. And the quote from Aeschylus says, this is from a book called Prometheus Bound. It was written around 450 BC. It said that Zeus, it says, it was his wish to wipe out man and rear another race. So you see the same story that you hear from Ovid, and you hear from Apollodorus. You also hear going all the way back to Aeschylus. So I just want to show you the antiquity of the story about God destroying man and about this flood. Aeschylus' story goes back to 450 BC, which is pre-Socratic, right? This is late antiquity. It's a very, very ancient. It continues like this. Deucalion built an ark at Prometheus's direction. He put into it supplies and boarded it with Pyrrha. Zeus poured a great rain from heaven and flooded most of Hellas, so that all the people were destroyed except the few who escaped to a nearby high mountain. At the time, the mountains in Thessaly split, and everything outside of the Isthmus and the Peloponnese was flooded. Deucalion was carried in the ark across the sea for 9 days and an equal number of nights, and landed on Mount Parnassus. There, when the rain stopped, he disembarked and sacrificed to Zeus. Zeus sent Hermes to him and bade him choose whatever he wanted. Deucalion chose to have people. At Zeus's direction, he picked up rocks and threw them over his head. The ones Deucalion threw became men, and the ones Pyrrha threw became women. Okay, so you see lots of the same content that we saw from Ovid. This is obviously the Greek version, the more ancient version, but a lot of the same details are there. A couple of interesting things. It says that the flood, it flooded most of Hellas, right? It flooded most of the area of Greece and kind of eastern Turkey. So that area was flooded. It doesn't say that all of the world was flooded, which is kind of an interesting little detail, but all of the known world, or the world that mattered to the Greeks, was destroyed. It also says a few people survived in the high mountains, not just Deucalion. If you go back to Ovid, you'll remember Ovid said that those other people that survived ended up dying of starvation. So maybe they didn't survive long. But this story doesn't say so. So there's a couple of slight differences. But then it says that Deucalion was carried in the ark, right? So we know Prometheus, the god, has given him a warning about the flood, just like we see in the Bible. He builds an ark, just like we see in the Bible. And then it says it rains for 9 days and an equal number of nights, right? We see this in the Bible. How long does it rain in the Bible? 40 days and 40 nights. I just want to show you the theme because it's not clear to me why it's important that the number of days and nights be identical, but this is what we see over and over again in these stories. 9 days and 9 nights. And where does the boat land? On the high mountain, right? In the Bible, that's Ararat. In this story, Mount Parnassus. And what does he do? When the rain stops and the land starts to come back, he gets out of his boat and immediately sacrifices to Zeus, just as Noah did. Just as we saw Deucalion do in the Ovid account, just like we saw Manu do in the Indian account. And his prayers answered, just like we see in all the stories we've seen so far. Zeus sends Hermes to him and says, I will grant any prayer. What do you want? And it says, Deucalion chose to have people, right? His wish, his prayer was to repopulate the world with human beings. And then again, exactly what Ovid says happens. He's told to pick up the stones, throw them in the water, and those stones become the men and women that will allow the world to recover. All right, that brings me to the Lucian account from the Syrian goddess. Again, this one's got a little bit more of that Eastern influence. So let me just read this to you, relatively short, this one as well, and then we'll get into the biblical story and the most ancient version. Okay, so Lucian tells us this. He says, Deucalion, in whose time the great flood occurred. I have heard the story from the Greeks themselves. The story runs as follows. The present race of men was not the first to be created. The men of the original creation were rebellious and willful and performed unholy deeds, disregarding the sanctity of oaths and hospitality and behaving cruelly. And it was for these misdeeds that the great destruction fell on them. All right, so there's more, obviously, but I want to mention to you when in the very beginning, when he says he's heard the story from the Greeks themselves and he's going to recount it, and he says the present race of men was not the first to be created. And so I asked myself, what does he mean by that? From the Greek perspective, and remember, Lucian is not a Greek exactly. Maybe culturally he is, but from a Greek perspective, these are the men that came before the current race. These are the 5 ages of man: gold, silver, bronze, blah, 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 blah. These other people had come first and been destroyed. This is common, in the Greek theogonies. We know this. So maybe that's the likely explanation. But here's what I find interesting. When he says the present race of men was not the first to be created, I also see a reference here to Adam and Noah. Right? Adam is the first man to be created. All of the men that exist up until the time of Noah are from that patriarch. They're all descending from Adam. After the flood, what happens? Men are now all descending from Noah. They're all descending from Deucalion. So when he talks about not the first race of men to be created, it seems to me that this analogy holds equally true for the myth about the ages of man as it does for this sort of biblical account of the first Adam and the second Adam, Noah. And then he's talking here about how terrible these people are, just like we saw, we know from the biblical story, which we'll see in a minute, but we saw in the earlier stories, not so much with the Indian version, but in the story of Ovid, it's talking about how corrupt human beings are, and you see this from Lucian. They were rebellious and willful. They performed unholy deeds. They disregarded oaths and hospitality, and they behaved cruelly. And for this reason, they had to be destroyed. And it says, straightway the earth discharged a vast volume of water, and the rivers of heaven came down in streams, and the sea mounted high. Thus everything became water, and all men perished. Deucalion alone was saved for another generation on the score of his wisdom and piety. He placed his children and his wives in an ark of vast size, and he himself also entered in. Now when he had embarked, there came to him wild boars and horses and generations of lions and serpents and all the other beasts which roam the earth, all in couples. He welcomed them all, and friendship remained amongst them as Zeus himself ordained. These, one and all, floated in this ark as long as the flood remained. All right, so this is where his story ends. It's a little bit premature, his retelling, but it also has some interesting details that we didn't see in the Apollodorus version. We didn't see more people other than he and his wife. In this case, it's he and his wives. And then he also says the animals started coming to him two by two, and he brought them on the boat because that's what Zeus intended. So now you have these very clearly biblical details making their way into the Greek story, which is interesting. But again, all the similar details. The water comes, all the men are perished. Deucalion is saved only because of his piety, because his moral standing and his worshipful, attitude. And so he, his children and wives were saved along with these animals. And the kind of punchline of the story is, and wouldn't you believe it, none of these animals on this boat even ate each other because Zeus said that they should, be friends until the flood was done so they could repopulate the earth. And that's really the gist of the Lucian account. So we've done Apollodorus, we've done Lucian, we've got the good fundamental understanding of the Greek story. We've done Ovid, so we know kind of how the latter Roman account looks. We've seen the second oldest account, which is the Indian account, with some unusual details, but all of the sort of main points are there. And now what I want to do is read the biblical version. I want to do that. Probably we all know it, but I want to do that because I think that some of the details, especially with the words and phrases, are going to really stand out when we get to the Babylonian version, which is coming up next. All right, so I'm going to read a bit from Genesis here, a couple of chapters. I'm going to begin right after this account of the Watchers. These are the giants that we talked about earlier, where the angels come down, the Watchers, the sons of God. They come down and they sleep with the mortal women, the daughters of men, and their children become these giants, these Nephilim. So this is part of what pisses God off and part of what brings the flood. An interesting parallel to the Roman story that we haven't seen anywhere else yet. All right, so let me just begin. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days. When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, remember, this sounds a lot like the description we just read from Lucian about how human beings, they weren't honoring hospitality. They're, all these terrible qualities. And this is what the Bible's telling us. The imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth. I mean, that last two sentences is verbatim from the Greek accounts, right? It says Zeus repented that he had made man, that he had made this iron age of man or bronze age of man, and it grieved him. That's exactly what the Greek story says. And Zeus said, I will destroy the man, right? I will destroy them. And this is exactly what you hear God say in the Bible. All right, he goes on, he says, and God said unto Noah, make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth 50 cubits, the height 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories thou shalt make it. So you got all these weird details. How big it needs to be. It needs to have multiple stories. It needs to be covered on the top. It needs to have a window and a door, right? All this stuff. And he says, and behold, even I do bring a flood of waters, and everything that is in the earth shall die. And with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives, and of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come unto thee, to keep them alive. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded. And so he did. And the Lord said, Come thou and all thy house into the ark. For thee I have seen righteousness before me in this generation, right? So that's important. He says, for thee I have seen righteousness in this generation. He's saying that Noah is the exception. All of the other human beings have become corrupt and tainted, but Noah is that shining example of a moral, upstanding person, just like Deucalion. We didn't quite get that expression from the Indian story, but maybe a bit, right? He's able to commune with the avatar. That maybe makes him special in some way. So you've got some overlap. But this is the explanation for why Noah gets a warning, and why Manu and why Deucalion get a warning, because they all get a warning of the flood. There's some reason, something about them, that they're moral upstanding. I mean, Manu, in the Indian version, he took the time and the effort to not only obey the god, but also to raise this fish and to carry it to the ocean. And he did all that, right? So he's somebody who's reliable and somebody that honors his commitments and honors the gods, right? He's upstanding, just like Noah, just like Deucalion. All right, it goes on. It says, I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So you see that replicated number. And every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters was upon the earth. Now, I wanted to emphasize that Noah was 600 when this happened. Just hold that in your mind until we get to the Babylonian story. Just remember that Noah was 600 years old when this happened. It goes on, it says, and Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, into the ark because of the waters of the flood. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth, and the mountains were covered. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And God remembered Noah, and every living thing that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. And the waters returned off the earth continually. And the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased, and Noah opened the window of the ark, and sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro, until the waters were dried up from off the earth. Also he sent forth a dove, to see if the waters were abated. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him in the ark. For the waters were on the face of the whole earth. He stayed yet another 7 days, and again sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters were abated. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again. And God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife, and thy sons' wives, with thee. Bring forth with thee every living thing which is with thee, that they may breed abundantly in the earth. And Noah went forth and builded an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Behold, I will establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you. So this is the biblical version. And you see all those interesting elements that we talked about. After the flood resides, they get out, they make the burnt offering to God. We've seen that in every story. We have this interesting detail about releasing the birds. We haven't yet seen that, but we will see that here in a moment. So all those little details are there. Now that brings me to the final bit, which is the oldest of these stories. We're going to talk about the Sumerian Babylonian stories. The translation I'm using are Stephanie Dalley's translation, come from like the late 80s. Just so you know, so the Sumerian culture is one of the very oldest, if not the oldest, that we know about historically. Dates back to 6000 BC. These were not Semitic people. They were not Indo-European people. They're sort of a strange, deep historical mystery about who the Sumerians were. But they had this story of Noah, and they called him Zasudra. I just want to tell you how deep this story goes. That's why I'm talking about the Sumerians. This goes back to 6000 BC and beyond, and Noah was called Zasudra. Now, there were other people that were associated with the Sumerians that came later and kind of took over, and they were Semitic people. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, just like the Jews, they were a Semitic people speaking a Semitic language. The names they used for Noah were Utnapishtim and Atrahasis. So all of these names, now we're throwing around lots of names: Noah, Deucalion, Manu, Zasudra, Utnapishtim, and Atrahasis. All of these names are Noah, the man who survives the flood. Now, when we're talking about Akkadian and Babylonian, we're talking, from about 2500 BC all the way up to late antiquity, about 600 BC. These stories we're going to read are on the older side of that, maybe 1800, 1700 BC. We're going to begin with the 7 tablets of creation. We're talking a little bit about Gilgamesh in a minute because it also tells the story. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to read the 7 tablets of creation. These are clay tablets in cuneiform that we found, very, very ancient, some of the oldest writings that we have, period. All right, let me just begin. 7 tablets of creation began like this. When the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great. The gods said, "Let us confront our chamberlain and get him to relieve us of our hard work." Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of, because the stories that I'm reading for you now are a little bit fragmentary. I'm going to give you a little bit, I'm going to set up some of these things as best I can. So what's happening here is that they're calling, the gods are saying, look, we're doing too much work. It's killing us. We have to do something about this. So let's call the chamberlain. Now, this is bringing a council together, just like we saw in the Roman version. We're bringing a council together of the gods. And if you know anything about the ancient Babylonians, they called the gods the Anunnaki. You may have heard that before. Also the Agigi. There's 2 kind of groups of gods, the Anunnaki and the Agigi, but that's who's gathering. So these gods are gathering, and one of the gods, Enlil, he basically opens up this conversation saying, why have the gods assembled? And this is what they say. Every single one of us gods declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble too much. All right, so I want to stop here for a second because we're talking about the Anunnaki, and now we're talking about how their work is too hard, stop the digging, and there's alarms going off if you're Ancient Aliens fans. Zecharia Sitchin and all this. And listen, I never read Zecharia Sitchin. I've heard the stories, but I've heard the criticisms as well. So when Zecharia Sitchin talks about the Anunnaki creating human beings to mine for gold, and the Anunnaki were aliens, they needed the gold, that whole song and dance, this is where it comes from. All right, the gods are saying we're working too hard, it's killing us. We're not going to do any more digging. The gods have to, the high god has to do something, because otherwise we're going to declare war. That's what's happening right here. Now, I don't know what they're digging for. I think that the primordial gods work, like what is the work that the primordial gods do? I think it has something more to do with like terraforming. It has something more to do with building order out of chaos, like making the habitable world. That's what creation is. So I think the work the gods are doing is something like that, and not some Zecharia Sitchin stuff. But anyway, this is how it opens up. The gods are saying our work is too hard, the trouble too much. And it continues like this. Enlil listened to the speech. His tears flowed. And he addressed Anu. He says, "Noble one, while the Anunnaki are sitting here before you, call up one god and let them cast him for destruction." Okay. So here I want to point out that that assembly of the gods that we're talking about, we saw in the Deucalion story. There's also a parallel to this in the book of Job, which I just want to kind of highlight. In the book of Job, it's God and a whole council of angels debating what to do about Job. And it's a council very much like this and a question very much like this in the book of Job. So just another little parallel. All right, so Enlil is one of the gods. Anu is like the high god. And so Enlil is saying, to the high god, help us. And in order to help us, it seems like one of these gods has to be destroyed, right? It says, call one god and let them cast him for destruction. So what's going on here? All right, so it continues. We're introducing a goddess. Her name is Mami. She's the womb goddess. So it says, Mami, the womb goddess, is present. Let her create primeval man so that he may bear the yoke. Let man bear the load of the gods, right? So human beings are being created specifically to do the work that the gods were doing. It says, Enki made his voice heard and spoke to the great god. One god should be slaughtered. Nintu shall mix clay with his flesh and his blood. Then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. Now, if you're a careful listener, you're going to remember when we were reading Ovid, there was something about the giant's blood being mixed with the blood of the earth. And so you have something like this happening here. So when man is being created, there's a couple of gods involved. One of the gods has to be sacrificed. And you'll learn from other texts that god is called Kingu. He's sacrificed. His blood is mixed with the clay. And this is the magic that's necessary to bring about mankind. In the Greek story, it was water and clay. In this story, it's clay and blood, the blood of the god. Okay. All right. So it says, after she had mixed the clay, she called up the great gods. She said, I have carried out perfectly the work that you ordered of me. You have slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. You have bestowed noise on mankind. I have undone the fetter and granted freedom. So she's brought this being to life. All right. Now the flood happens, right? Human beings have been created to do the work for the gods. And now this falls right into the flood story. And it says this, 600 years passed and the country became too wide, the people too numerous. Now, remember when I told you when we were reading the biblical story about Noah being 600 years old when the flood came? I told you to hold that in your mind. This is why. Because in the Babylonian story, you have this strange parallel. 600 years passes and the country becomes too wide and the people too numerous. And that's, by the way, exactly what the Bible says. People are flourishing. There's all these people now. This story goes on. It says, the country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their racket. Enlil had to listen to their noise. He addressed the great gods. He said, the noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. Give the order that disease shall break out. Right? So Enlil's pissed, right? The gods that we created to do all of our work, they won't shut the hell up, and it's driving the gods crazy. All right, so this is the reason for the flood, guys. Noise and pestering the gods are experiencing. That's the reason here. It says, now there was one, Atrahasis, whose ear was open to his god, Enki. He would speak with the god, and his god would speak with him, right? So this is the Noah guy in the story, Atrahasis, and this is talking about why he's special, why he's going to be warned about the flood, because his ears were open to the god. He could speak with the god and hear the god, right? That he has this special grace. He's a very devout man. This is exactly what we saw with Noah and Deucalion and Manu. The biblical version of this is, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. All right, the story continues. Enki made his voice heard and spoke to his servant. Right, now I'm going to paraphrase. So Enki intervenes with Atrahasis, with Noah, 3 separate times because Enlil's trying to destroy mankind. Remember, he wants to bring disease to kill man because they're too noisy. That's his first attempt. And 3 separate times he does different things trying to kill human beings. And each time Enki intervenes and prevents the destruction of human beings. And then Enlil kind of gets wise, and he blames Enki for his lack of success in punishing man, killing them off. And he tells Enki, he says, you must create a flood. It is indeed your power that shall be used against your people. Right? So Enlil is going to make Enki. Enki's like the Prometheus in this story, the one that cares about human beings, the one that was involved with their creation, the one that's looking out for them, that recognizes Atrahasis as being devout and wants to save him. And Enlil's like, you're going to have to kill him. I'm going to make you kill the human beings that you love so much that you've been protecting. It's now your job. Well, that also gives Enki an opportunity to warn Atrahasis again, right? Because he's the one pulling the trigger. And that's exactly what he does. So he warns Atrahasis, and he tells him to dismantle his house and build a boat. And this is just listen to how it goes. It goes, the boat you build, roof it like Apsu, so the sun cannot see inside it. Apsu is like the mountain where the fresh water comes off from the top. So roof it like a mountain, so the sun cannot see it in it. Make upper decks and lower decks. The tackle must be very strong, the bitumen strong to give strength. I shall make rain fall on you here 7 nights worth. Right, so you have the same 7 days, 7 nights situation you see in the Bible, but you also have this instructions for how the boat is to be built. He talks about having upper decks and lower decks and using strong bitumen. And I just want you to hear the biblical parallels. In the Bible, it says, make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms thou shalt make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without. So pitch and bitumen are the same thing here. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it, right? Right? And Enki tells Atrahasis, make upper decks and lower decks. So you have some of the very same language here. All right, then it goes on, it says, fat ones, he's talking about animals, fat ones he selected and put on board. The birds that fly in the sky, cattle, wild animals of open country he put on board. He put his family on board. The flood came out against the people like an army. No one could see anyone else. The flood roared like a bull, like a wild ass screaming. The winds howled. The darkness was total. There was no sun. For 7 days and 7 nights, the torrent, storm, and flood came on. Whew, man. It may be more terrifying description than what you see in the Bible, but you do see the same 7 days and 7 nights. You do see the same sort of, the cattle and the wild animals, and like you see those same details that we saw in the biblical story. All right. So after the flood subsides, the world is quiet. But as soon as the gods believe that they had finally solved the human problem, right, all the noise is gone, then you get this piece. The gods smelt the fragrance of a burnt offering. Right? So what does Noah do when the flood starts to recede? Immediately he gets out, whether we're talking about Manu, Deucalion, Noah, he comes out and he makes a sacrifice to God. But in this most ancient story, it's not such a warm reception, right? God doesn't immediately say, like he does in all the other stories, I'll grant you any prayer you have, I'll grant you, like I'm going to, I smell the fragrance. I'm grateful that there's still somebody worshiping us, and I'm going to give you what you want. That's not what happens here. God smell the fragrance, and they realize somebody's down there burning offerings, somebody who should be dead, right? And again, you see the same thing happen in the Bible. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings. Exactly the same thing. All right, so the story continues. The gods ate the offering, but were furious that someone had survived the flood. And Enlil said, we agreed together on an oath. No form of life should have escaped. How did any man survive the catastrophe? Enlil says, who but Enki would do this? And it goes on, it says, Enki made his voice heard and spoke to the great gods. He said, I did it in defiance of you. I made sure life was preserved. Man, the hair stands up on my arms. Can you imagine saying to a god, yeah, it was me, and I did it in defiance of you, But this is exactly what Prometheus did, right? When he stole fire from Zeus, and he was not supposed to give that fire to man. That was prohibited, and he does it anyway. specifically in defiance of Zeus. So you have this weird parallel reaching over to the Greek side of the story. All right, so this is where the Tablets of Creation stop talking about the flood. But we do have another epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. At the end of that story, Gilgamesh, the king, meets a man, Utnapishtim. He's Noah, and Noah tells him his story. So let me tell you that one. It's brief. Let me tell you that one. It begins, it says, the great city of Shuruppak was already old when the gods decided they should make a flood. The god E commanded Utnapishtim. He said, man of Shuruppak, dismantle your house, build a boat, put aboard the seeds of all living things. All right, so you see all those familiar details right there from the Noah story. He says, the boat you are to build shall have her dimensions in proportion with her width, and length shall be in harmony. Roof her like the Apsu. 1 acre was her circumference, 10 pole each height of her walls. I put on board the boat all my kith and kin, put on board cattle from open country, wild beasts, all kinds of craftsmen. In the evening, a rain showered down. All right, so let me stop there for a second. A couple of interesting details. You see the same language you see in the Bible about the cattle and the fowl and the son and his sons and daughters and their wives and so forth. Even the details of how the boat's to be built. You have a lot of these specific construction instructions that we see in the Bible as well. A couple of variances though. It says he puts craftsmen on the boat with him. Right, he's going to need people that know how to do masons of various kinds and all that sort of thing. So it's Utnapishtim and his wife and all the animals, but also some particular experts that he has to bring with him. And the biblical version that gives you the parallel to the details of the boat goes like this. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. This is exactly like we're seeing here. The width and length shall be in harmony. Roof her like the Apsu, 1 acre her circumference, 10 pole each height. You see what I mean? The story continues. I saw the shape of the storm. The storm was terrifying to see. Everything light turned to darkness. On the first day, the tempest rose up, blew swiftly, and brought the flood weapon like a battle force over the people. Ishtar screamed like a woman giving birth. She said, I myself gave birth to them. They are my own people, yet they fill the sea like fish spawn. The gods of the Anunnaki were weeping with her. And so Ishtar is like the great mother goddess. She's the thing that gives birth to all living, all created beings. So she's crying at the death of all of the human beings now floating in the sea like fish spawn. And all the council of gods, the Anunnaki, they're crying over it. It says, for 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew. Flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. It says, when the 7th day arrived, the sea became calm. The wind grew quiet. The flood held back. Silence reigned, for all mankind had returned to clay. So again, human beings made from clay, right? All mankind has returned to clay, like from ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You see that there. It says, I look for banks, for limits to the sea. Areas of land were emerging everywhere. The boat had come to rest on Mount Nemush. And this is, of course, parallel to the biblical story. And the waters were abated, and the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. So now we've seen Mount Parnassus, we've seen Mount Ararat, we've seen Mount Nemush, perhaps one of the peaks of the Himalayas from the Indian story, but in all cases, the high mountain peak, which would have been a sacred site. The high mountain peaks were always sacred sites in antiquity. Spots closest to the gods, if that makes sense. It goes on, it says, when the 7th day arrived, I put out and released a dove. The dove went, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned round. I put out and released a raven. The raven went and saw the waters receding and did not turn around. Then I put everything out to the 4 winds, and I made a sacrifice. The gods smelt the fragrance. The gods, like flies, gathered over the sacrifice. So again, you have this weird repetition of these birds being sent out, ravens and doves. The biblical account, if you've forgotten, says, and he sent forth a raven to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. And he stayed yet other 7 days and sent forth a dove, which returned not. You have all those details here. And then, of course, coming out of the ark and making the sacrifice and God smelling the fragrance. All right, so when Enlil discovers that someone survived the flood, and this story, he's also furious about it, and he says this, no man should have lived through the destruction. Enlil came into the boat and seized my hand and led me up. He led up my woman and made her kneel down at my side. He touched our foreheads, stood between us, blessed us, and said, until now Utnapishtim was mortal, but henceforth Utnapishtim and his woman shall be as we gods are. Okay. So what's happened here is the gods, fate was decreed by the gods that nothing was to survive the flood. Because that was broken, and Enlil saved, or Enki saved Utnapishtim, right? The fate was circumvented, and that's not allowed. So no one was supposed to survive. So what do? Seems like the gods have only two choices. Either they kill these two human beings who survived, or they remove them from the world of the living, right? And that doesn't have to be killing them if they turn them into gods. And that is what they chose to do in this version of the story. Isn't that interesting? And let me just read this last sentence to you again. It says, until now, Utnapishtim. So until now, Noah was mortal. But henceforth, Noah and his wife shall be as we gods are. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, there's a reason. To be as we gods are comes directly from the biblical story, from the Garden of Eden. And that verse goes like this, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So this was the warning that God gave to Adam and Eve about not eating the fruit of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And once they eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, they become as gods. This is what happened to Noah and his wife in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then it says, Utnapishtim shall dwell far off at the mouth of the rivers. They took me and made me to dwell far off. And if we go back to the Eden story, you can see the same there. Therefore, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden, right, to the land of Nod, far off. And that brings me to my conclusion. All right, for the Christians in the audience, you're probably familiar with Jesus being referred to sometimes as the second Adam, as though mankind was given another perfect, sinless figure to be the father, spiritually or figuratively, of the future of mankind. But in a way far more obvious, it would seem that Noah actually was the second Adam. He was the first of the new post-diluvian race. He is the patriarch from whom all future people emerge. In this way, he was the new Adam, as far as I can tell. I point this out in the context of the flood myth because the stories of the first man, Adam, and the sole survivor of the great flood, Noah, are conflated in many instances across cultural boundaries. Strange that. So, to conclude, I'd like to point out several of the stranger, less obvious similarities between these flood myths. First, however, let's review the obvious ones. Okay, with the exception of the Indian myth of Manu, which provides no reason for the flood, designates no duration, not 7 days or 40 days or 9 days, right? And it makes no mention of saving anyone else or any animals. The rest of the details are quite consistent across all the stories. We're given a reason for the flood. We see a divine warning provided to one morally upstanding figure, followed by instructions to build a ship, to take close family and animals on board, to come to rest on the peak of a high mountain, make a sacrifice or an offering, and then finally a promise to repopulate the earth. Those are the bones of every one of these stories. Now to the less obvious. In the most ancient story from the 7 Babylonian Tablets of Creation, we find a familiar motif surrounding the creation of mankind. Now, this is not especially surprising when you recognize that there are many other parallels between the 7 tablets of creation and the 7 days of creation that are described in the book of Genesis. Quite a lot of overlap there. In both cases, you have the first man created from clay and one other critical ingredient. The Greek account from Apollodorus suggests that the ingredients are clay and water. The Babylonian tale suggests clay mixed with the lifeblood of a slain god. In similar fashion, the biblical story speaks of clay into which the Spirit of God is breathed. So those are the 2 ingredients. Now, those 2 Semitic stories, the biblical and the Babylonian accounts, they emphasize that something like man is part matter, which is the clay or the earth, and part spirit. So we're kind of like an incarnation, you might say. A spirit, the Spirit of God, coming to possess the clay form, something like an incarnation. And while it may not be as apparent in the Greek account, water has just as mystical a connotation. For instance, one of the greatest pre-Socratic philosophers, you may know Thales of Miletus, believed water to be the arche. It's the fundamental principle, the source of everything, something very numinous and divine about that. And beyond this, the Roman account from Ovid, it mirrors the Babylonian perfectly. Ovid tells us, quote, "With native earth their blood the monsters mixed." Another common theme is the existence of a council of gods which decide upon the destruction of humanity. The Babylonian Tablets of Creation begin with a gathering of the Anunnaki where Enki, Enlil, and Anu are present. In the Enuma Elish, it's Tiamat, Apsu, and Ishtar. In the Gilgamesh epic, Ishtar is there. Apollodorus too describes a council of gods with notable roles from Zeus and Prometheus. And while the biblical account is more strictly monotheistic, we find the Hebrew God presiding over a council of angels very like these in the book of Job. While they are not deliberating on the destruction of mankind, they are deliberating on the destruction of one man, poor Job. Now, among the gods in these councils, we find another interesting parallel, where in the Babylonian account, we have the god Enki responsible for the salvation of humanity. In the Greek version, Prometheus serves the exact same role. In the Tablets of Creation, Enlil is furious to learn that Atrahasis survives the flood and blamed Enki, just as Zeus blames Prometheus for the gift of fire. Enki tells Enlil, quote, "I did it in defiance of you," just as Prometheus intentionally deceives Zeus. Okay, next there's the matter of the giants. And I have to say, I was the most surprised by this one. I knew, of course, about the biblical account of angelic watchers who descend to earth and lay with mortal women and have children that are giants, the Nephilim. That I know. What I never expected was to see a mirror of this in the Roman myth. And just as Genesis says, quote, "There were giants in the earth in those days," Ovid says, quote, "Against heaven the giants move." But what of these giants? The Bible tells us that they, quote, "took wives all which they chose, and bare children to them who became mighty men of renown." And Ovid says precisely the same. He says, "With native earth their blood the monsters mixed. The blood imbued with animating heat did impregnate earth, new sons beget." Mighty men of old, men of renown. But the parallels don't stop here. Consider these words of Ovid. "Hills piled on mountains, mountains lie, to make their mad approaches to the sky, till Jove no longer patient took his time to avenge with thunder their audacious crime." Compare that to chapter 11 of Genesis. Let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And then God's response to them trying to build this Tower of Babel. So the Lord confounded their language and scattered them upon the face of all the earth. Incredible. This idea of building the tower to heaven. You see that in Ovid, hills upon hills, mountains upon mountains to make their mad approach to the sky. And then you see Zeus's or Jove's vengeance for their audacious crime. This is exactly what the Tower of Babel story tells you in the Bible. Incredible, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, I could go on and on. So to wrap this up, let's return to where we began, to the conflation of the first Adam with the second. The account of Lucian points to this when he says that current man was not the first to be created. While it's perfectly fair to interpret this as a reference to those 5 races of man common to the Greek theogonies, it could just as easily refer to the race of Noah coming after the race of Adam. Now, Ovid too makes the parallel between the primordial couple and the post-diluvian couple stark by suggesting that only Deucalion and his wife survived the flood. They literally substitute or replace the original mother and father of mankind. In the Indian account, Manu, the Noah figure, is the only being to survive the flood. After the flood recedes and he makes his offering to the gods, a woman is created from it. She is the answer to his prayers for the race of man to return and repopulate the earth. But did you notice how closely this parallels the creation of Eve from Adam's rib? In both stories, you have something voluntarily given by the first man that creates the first woman, as well as the promise to be fruitful and multiply. Isn't that interesting? And let me end with the strangest parallel of all. When we rewind the clock 4,000 years to examine the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find something unprecedented among flood myths. In no other story, not even the closely related Tablets of Creation, do we see the Noah figure and his wife disappear. In every other account, they have a key function and a legacy to repopulate the earth. Not so for Utnapishtim. In the Gilgamesh epic, the gods become furious that a human survived the flood. And in order to rectify this violation of fate, the gods declare, quote, "Until now Utnapishtim was mortal, but henceforth Utnapishtim and his woman shall be as we gods are." And again, we compare this fate of Noah, of Utnapishtim, the second Adam, to the biblical Adam. Quote, "For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods." In both stories, the fate of man is to be as gods.
Well, there you have it. That's one